And Michael Rosen is here. I'm sure I've said that many times before. And usually, or often, he's been in to talk about poetry, or he's been in to talk about kids' books, or he's been in to talk about words, which is, his great speciality. And there's plenty of words in his new book, but they're about something very specific, because it's called The Disappearance of Émile Zola. And it tells the story of the great French writer coming to London on a year. But it also tells, via that, the story of love literature and the Dreyfus case. Michael Rosen, j'accuse.
Exactly. No, don't accuse me. I haven't done anything wrong.
J'accuse, who is not a Welsh bloke.
No, yes, I fell for that. Somebody did a little gag and said, "Is it about Jack Hughes?" And I went, "No. What's the point?" And anyway, he then explained.
Then the penny dropped.
Yes, exactly. A bit slow.
Why a book about Émile Zola? I mean, are you a Zolarista or whatever the term would be?
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in the whole period. I'm interested in Zola, and I'm very interested that a writer, after all, this is a novelist and a critic, that's what he was by profession, should have made such a political stand. He made himself unbelievably unpopular by taking a stand on what was the big issue of the day in France, namely the Dreyfus case. And just in case people don't know a little bit about that.
Yeah, let's run through that very quickly.
So Dreyfus was an army officer. And he was accused of espionage, that he had sold secrets to the Prussians.
What year are we talking here?
We're talking the early 1890s. So that Dreyfus had sold terrible secrets about guns, about a gun in particular, to the Prussians. And he was accused of having done that. Dreyfus was Jewish, and this was at a time when France was divided. There were even anti-Semitic parties, anti-Jewish parties in France. There were newspapers that called themselves anti-Semitic. So France was divided between, if you like, the ancien regime, those people who were monarchist, the Catholic establishment, anti-republicans, and then on the other side, a kind of array of people who we might describe as liberals or socialists or anarchists, and people who stood by the French Revolution and the Republic. So France was divided, and then along comes Dreyfus, and he is a Jewish officer, which is incredibly rare.
That must have been rare in and of itself.
Indeed, it was just extraordinary. He had come from Alsace-Lorraine, the territory between France and Germany, and so when it was found that this person had supposedly leaked secrets to the Prussians, well, then of course he was guilty because he was Jewish.
Right.
So that was like, because all Jews are traitors. This was the if you like, the kind of anti-Semitic sort of motif of that time. And Zola, as it happens, had written a tract against anti-Semitism. So he's not Jewish, Zola. His father was from Venice. His mother was French, Venice in Italy. And he decided to, as a novelist, I mean, it's extraordinary, really, he took up a stand as a non-Jew against the racism of the day, anti-Semitism. And he made this stand in an article. And then, of course, the people who are supporting Dreyfus, they come along to Zola and they go, "Will you support Dreyfus?" And at first he didn't, but then he did. And when he did, his intervention was extraordinary. So our gag about Jack Hughes and Jacques Hughes, that's where that comes in.
And why was it so extraordinary? Was it how big a figure was he in contemporary France, if you see what I mean?
He was massive. I mean, he was the star, if you like, of literature and culture. This is somebody who wrote a whole series of novels, a whole cycle of novels, some of which we know quite well in England, Thérèse Raquin in particular, Thérèse Raquin. We know, quite often have seen that on the television. And Zola sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands. He was known all over the world. He was sort of France's star. He had written about Paris of the era just before Zola actually lived. And he wrote about the downtrodden, the people on the edges, the margins of society, and he gave them dignity. So even though he wrote about prostitutes and alcoholics and so on, he gave them dignity, and he's one of the first people to do it. And he did it accurately. He did it scientifically in the school of so-called naturalism. So here's this guy, and then, what he did was he wrote this huge article, covered the whole of the front page of a national newspaper with the words "J'accuse," I accuse, all across the top, in which he talked about the Dreyfus case.
And why did that get him in so much trouble?
Well, because he was accusing. Who was he accusing? He was accusing the whole of the French ruling order,
the establishment,
the government and the army. Now, he took on the army. Now, the army, you've got to remember, in France was a popular army. They always thought of the army as the protecting democracy. That was how they saw it in France. The army had sort of a different image in other cultures, in other countries. And he accused the army of having rigged trials, not only the Dreyfus case, but also another case against the man who really did leak the story to the Prussians, leak the information about the gun. So he assumed that the trial, he accused the army officers, the whole chiefs of staff, of rigging the trial against that particular guy who's got the name Esterhazy. That brought on Zola's head the accusation of libel. In France, you could libel an institution. You couldn't. So he libelled the army basically, and they sentenced him to a year in prison and 3,000 francs. And instead of serving his time, he went on the run.
And he came here.
He did. He got on a train with nothing else but his nightshirt and a newspaper, and entirely on his own, and arrived at Victoria Station in June 1898.
This was obviously before the tunnel, so I presume he got
Before
the boat.
the tunnel, he got the boat. In fact, he wrote beautifully and sadly and awfully about the boat trip.
Had he been to Britain before? Did he know?
He had. He'd come in 1893, and as a hero, he went to Crystal Palace when it really was a palace and not what it is today.
A football team.
Oh, there you go. Yes, that's right. I watched them. In fact, I was at Arsenal watching them only the other day when they lost by a couple of goals. So he was feted at Crystal Palace, at the Crystal Palace itself. 4,000 guests turning up, fireworks, his picture in the sky. So only 5 years earlier, Zola was this acclaimed hero with people turning up at Victoria Station, the red carpet, the whole deal. Now he arrives on his own.
As a fugitive?
On the run.
Where does he go? Because his choice of place to go is slightly unpredictable.
Right, so he's got to hide.
He's not going to go to Soho.
Well, no, he isn't, because you see what they're worried about him and his friends, his translator, a man by the name of Ernest Vizetelly. They're worried that the French can conserve a writ on him.
Right.
And even extradite.
So get him extradited.
Well, yeah, exactly. So he's basically incognito. So to start off with, he's at the Grosvenor Hotel round the corner from Victoria Station. Then he's whisked off to another hotel down in Walton-on-Thames, the Oatlands Park Hotel. And then he stays in a place called Penn. That's in Walton-on-Thames. Sorry, I got my places wrong there. Weybridge, Walton-on-Thames. And then in Addlestone, he stays in a place. And then eventually, most of his stay is at the Queen's Hotel in Upper Norwood.
Upper Norwood.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Zola, this man who's written about the Paris low life.
Maybe he was a Crystal Palace fan.
Exactly.
It's always possible.
Emile Zola, Crystal Palace fan.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right. I'm sure of it. Yeah.
How was this trip and his time here well chronicled?
Yes, it was chronicled by Ernest Vizetelly, his translator, who wrote a book with Zola in London. But apart from that, it's not well chronicled. But what he did was write letters home. He wrote letters to his wife, Alexandrine, and then he wrote to the mother of his two children, Jeanne Rosen.
Yeah, because the mother of his two children and his wife are not the same person.
Indeed.
It's all very French.
It is. He genuinely did live in a ménage à trois, not both ladies under the same roof, but very nearby on all occasions.
And knowing each other?
Boy, did they know each other. Yes, indeed. Jeanne had been Alexandrine's, there isn't really a word for it, but a seamstress, couturier, the person who basically sewed Alexandrine's underwear. It does get that intimate. So Jeanne had been the maid, yes.
Right.
And so he was having that relationship and carried on married to Alexandrine, and they came alternately, if you like. So Alexandrine,
so to speak.
Exactly. Alexandrine was thought would come first, but in actual fact, she said to Zola, "I think you need autre consolation. You need other consolations." And so Jeanne came first with the two children, and they spent an idyllic and beautiful summer at this house called Penn in Walton-on-Thames, and again at Addlestone in this house called Summerfield. And then she went back, and then Alexandrine came out, and they lived in the hotel, in the Queen's Hotel. Alexandrine came out twice, and then she went back, and then Jeanne came out again for Easter, and they stayed in a hotel just by Crystal Palace. So that, yes, it was arranged.
I mean, people must have known he was here. So what did the French authorities try and do anything about it?
In the end, the French knew he was here. They pretty certainly put spies on him at the beginning,
right.
Realised they couldn't extradite him because you couldn't extradite people who were guilty of libel.
Right.
So if he had been a sort of common or garden crim, they could have got him, but libel wasn't covered by the extradition laws. So they laid off him. They didn't grab him at all. It seems that the English, the Brits, the Londoners, and so on knew who he was. I mean, I found out, for example, that there was even I love this. a waxwork of Zola in Madame Tussauds while he was here. He doesn't ever make a mention of it, so I don't know whether he knew. I found adverts in the very newspapers where I was Googling, you see, Zola at this time, in the newspapers, The Guardian, the Evening Standard, the Evening News, and all the rest of it, and suddenly up pops this thing called Zola Portrait Model. I thought, what's a portrait model? Up it comes, Madame Tussauds.
Really?
There he was. He was down the road in Baker Street while he was sitting in Crystal Palace, and I conjured up a picture, really. Wouldn't it have been fun if he had got on the train from Crystal Palace to Baker Street? Several trains, of course, as you know better than me. Well, indeed, don't we all? And yes, he could have got on the train. But also, what was slightly sad, in a way, was that there were writers very interested in Zola. Thomas Hardy was very interested, even though he pretended he wasn't. Henry James. The Fabian Society was very interested in Zola. The forerunners to the Labour Party and the Communist Party, that's to say the Social Democratic Federation, were writing articles about him, and he didn't see any of them. The only person he saw was George Moore, who's a novelist, some people read his novels still, who loved Zola and tried to imitate Zola. And the only other major visitor he saw was the leader of the French Socialists, Jean Jaurès, who was the person who, some people will know, was assassinated on the eve of the First World War for opposing the war itself.
Did the struggle in the Dreyfus case continue in his absence? Or?
It did, because where was Dreyfus? Dreyfus was dying in a terrible state on Devil's Island, that people will know of through Papillon, maybe. Yep. So he was dying in what used to be called French Guiana, on the island. Because of the efforts of the people who supported Dreyfus, including Zola, he was brought back and tried again. That happened after Zola came back. Zola went back to France the moment he knew that Dreyfus had been recalled, and then the Dreyfus case carried on. Dreyfus himself was eventually pardoned, but of course he was pardoned by the government and not by the army. In fact, Dreyfus has never been pardoned by the people who found him guilty.